Welcome now. Before we start, I ask you to subscribe. Tell us where you're from and don't forget to leave a like. The Airstream's heater struggled against the bitter January wind as I pulled into the remote camping spot in Black Hills. After everything that happened, I thought isolation was what I needed. The rangers at the entrance had given me odd looks when I mentioned camping here during winter, but I ignored their warnings. Even the old man at the general store had muttered something about keeping away from the high grounds after dark. I should have listened. The sun was already setting when I finished leveling the RV, casting long shadows through the snow-covered pines. Something about the silence felt wrong. No birds, no wildlife, just the hollow sound of wind through bare branches. I tried calling to check the weather forecast, but there was no signal. Not unusual for these remote parts, I thought. The forecast had promised clear skies for the next few days anyway. Setting up camp took longer than expected, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The temperature was dropping faster than it should, and the Airstream's heating system was making strange noises. I told myself it was just the extreme cold affecting the equipment. Still, I made sure to stock extra propane and check all the systems twice. Better safe than sorry out here, especially alone. I spent the evening organizing my supplies and trying to ignore the growing unease. The isolation I'd sought now felt oppressive, like the mountains themselves were watching. Every creak of the Airstream's metal shell in the wind made me jump. I kept telling myself this was exactly what I needed, time alone to process everything. No one to find me, no questions to answer. Night fell quickly, bringing with it a darkness deeper than any I'd experienced. The stars seemed wrong somehow. Too bright, too close, arranged in patterns that made my eyes hurt. I closed all the blinds and turned up the electric heater, but the cold seemed to seep in through every seam. The main heater was definitely struggling now, making a rhythmic clicking sound that almost sounded like counting. That's when I heard it. A sound that shouldn't exist in this empty wilderness. From somewhere in the darkness came 3 distinct knocks, as if someone was standing outside my door. But when I gathered the courage to look through the window, the pristine snow around the Airstream was completely undisturbed. No footprints, no tracks, just 3 more knocks, this time from the roof. The knocking continued all night, moving around the Airstream like some twisted game of tag. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by that rhythmic tapping and the increasingly erratic sounds from the heater. When dawn finally broke, I was already dressed and ready to move somewhere else. That's when I discovered the engine wouldn't start. I spent hours checking everything I could think of, battery, starter, fuel lines, but found nothing obviously wrong. The engine simply refused to turn over, as if something had drained all its power. Even stranger, my phone and laptop were both dead, despite being fully charged the night before. The solar panels on the roof should have been providing backup power, but the control panel showed 0 output, despite the clear sky. The sun was directly overhead when I noticed the first tracks in the snow. They looked almost human, but the stride length was impossible. 8 feet between prints at least, and they seemed to start and stop randomly, as if whatever made them could appear and disappear at will. The worst part, they all circled the Airstream, growing closer with each loop. The temperature kept dropping throughout the day. Well below what my gear was rated for, the main heater had stopped working entirely, leaving me with just the small electric backup. Ice was forming on the inside of the windows now, creating patterns that looked disturbingly like faces. I tried to radio for help but got only static and what sounded like whispers in a language I'd never heard. As the day wore on, I began to notice other changes. The shadows cast by the surrounding trees seemed to move independently of the sun, always pointing toward the Airstream. The snow around the vehicle had developed a strange, crystalline quality, reflecting light in ways that didn't follow natural laws. Every time I looked away and back, the patterns had shifted slightly. Night was approaching again, and I knew I couldn't survive another one. The batteries were nearly dead, and the cold was becoming unbearable. That's when I saw it through the front window, a figure standing motionless at the tree line, too tall, too thin, its proportions all wrong. And as I watched in horror, It took one impossible step forward, covering half the distance to my Orv in a single stride. The creature moved with an unnatural grace, each step covering impossible distances. I scrambled to barricade the door with what little furniture I had, knowing it wouldn't make any difference. The walls of the airstream suddenly felt paper thin, offering no protection from whatever was approaching. Through the frosted windows, I could see more shapes emerging from the trees. My hands shook as I grabbed my emergency flares, the only weapons I had. The temperature inside the ARV had dropped so low that my breath crystallized instantly, forming bizarre geometric patterns in the air. The creatures, I could see 3 of them now, continued their approach. Their bodies seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than I could perceive. The first attack came from above. A long, spindly limb punched through the roof like it was aluminum foil. I barely managed to dodge, falling backwards into the kitchen area. The limb retracted, leaving behind a perfectly circular hole through which stars that shouldn't exist twinkled. The metal around the hole had turned black and brittle, as if it had aged 1,000 years in seconds. Something was affecting my mind now. Every time the creatures moved, I could hear a sound like glass breaking. But it was happening inside my head. Memories I'd tried to forget were surfacing, the reasons I'd come here, what I was running from. But these thoughts felt foreign, as if something else was rifling through my mind like a filing cabinet. The attacks intensified, puncturing the airstream's shell from multiple angles. Each breach let in air so cold it burned, carrying with it whispers that made no sense, yet felt horrifyingly familiar. I retreated to the bathroom, the only space left intact. Through the holes in the RV's walls, I could see that the sky had changed. The stars were gone, replaced by something that hurt to look at. I was trapped, surrounded by entities that defied comprehension. When I remembered the old man's words at the store, he hadn't just warned about staying away from the high ground. He'd mentioned something about the caves. As another limb pierced the bathroom wall, I realized my only chance was to make a run for the cave system I'd passed on the way in. If I could just reach it before they caught me. The dash from the airstream to the cave entrance was a blur of terror and impossible geometries. Snow crunched under my feet as I ran, but the sound was wrong. Delayed, as if happening seconds after my steps, the creatures pursued in their strange, discontinuous way, appearing and disappearing like glitches in reality. Each time they vanished, they reappeared closer. The cave mouth seemed to warp and twist as I approached, its dimensions shifting in ways that made my head spin. Behind me, I could hear a sound like reality tearing. The creatures were no longer trying to hide their true nature. The air itself seemed to crystallize in their wake, forming structures that resembled mathematics more than matter. My lungs burned with each breath of the impossibly cold air. Inside the cave, darkness swallowed me whole. My flashlight beam seemed to bend and refract off walls that couldn't possibly be arranged the way they appeared. The passage spiraled downward at an angle that should have been impossible to walk, yet my feet found purchase. The creature's pursuit had become eerily silent, but I could feel them getting closer, not just behind me, but somehow ahead, and beside me too. The deeper I went, the more the cave seemed alive. The walls pulsed with a faint bioluminescence that cast no shadows. Ancient markings covered every surface, not petroglyphs or cave paintings, but complex equations and diagrams that hurt my eyes to look at. Some were recent, carved by other victims who'd fled here. Others seemed older than humanity itself. My flashlight caught something ahead, a chamber opening up, its walls lined with what looked like technology, but not any kind I recognized. The devices, if that's what they were, appeared to be growing out of the rock itself, pulsing with the same otherworldly light as the cave walls. In the center stood a pillar, covered in symbols identical to the ones I'd seen in my dreams last night. As I approached the pillar, the air became thick with static electricity. The creatures had stopped pursuing, but I could sense them gathering at the chamber entrance. They were waiting for something. That's when I noticed the handprint indentation on the pillar. A human handprint, fresh blood stained its edges, and next to it, scratched hastily into the stone, were the words, "Don't touch it, run." My hand hovered over the ancient handprint as reality itself seemed to hold its breath. The creatures remained at the chamber entrance, their forms rippling with anticipation. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew there was nowhere left to go. The blood around the handprint was still wet, glistening in the ethereal light. Whoever left that warning couldn't have been here more than a few hours ago. Time began to stutter and skip like a broken record. With each jump, the creatures moved closer, their bodies unfolding in ways that made my vision blur. The cave's bioluminescence pulsed faster, synchronizing with my heartbeat. Or was my heart synchronizing with it? The distinction seemed less important as the boundaries between flesh and stone, time and space, began to blur. The decision was made for me when one of the creatures lunged, not at me, but at the pillar itself. In pure reflex, I slammed my hand into the indentation. Pain shot through my arm as ancient machinery hummed to life. The symbols on the pillar began to rotate and shift, each movement accompanied by sounds that existed somewhere between music and mathematics. My hand was stuck fast, becoming part of the mechanism. What happened next exists in my memory as fragments, shards of experience too sharp to examine closely. The chamber filled with light that had mass, sound that had color. The creatures screamed in frequencies that shattered reality itself. I saw other times, other victims, other outcomes. Infinite variations of this moment stretching backwards and forwards through time. I saw what the creatures really were and why they needed us. The last thing I clearly remember is pulling my hand free and running. The cave had become a maze of non-Euclidean angles, but somehow my feet knew where to go. Behind me, the chamber collapsed in ways that violated physics, folding in on itself like origami made of space-time. The creatures' howls followed me up through the twisted passages, but they couldn't follow. The pillar's activation had trapped them, at least temporarily. I emerged into early morning light. Though I had no way of knowing how much time had passed, the airstream was gone, leaving only a perfect circle of blackened earth. The snow around it had melted in a precise geometric pattern that matched the symbols from the pillar. My phone was working again, showing missed calls from 3 days ago. As I stared at the screen, a final message carved itself into my mind. They'll be free again when the stars align. Next time, they'll be ready. If you're reading this, stay away from the Black Hills in winter. The caves aren't empty, and what lives in them is getting better at hunting us. They're learning. The desert was alive with color when I parked my grand design momentum in a remote area of the Mojave. The superbloom had transformed the barren landscape into a sea of purple and gold wildflowers, perfect conditions for the photo series I'd been planning. My high-end camera equipment sat ready, worth more than the RV itself. The forecast mentioned possibility of winds, but nothing serious. I spent the afternoon scouting locations, marking GPS coordinates of the most spectacular flower clusters. Looking through my telephoto lens, I noticed something odd. The flowers seemed to sway even when there was no wind. When I checked the spots on foot, the movement stopped. I blamed it on heat distortion. Though the temperature was mild for spring, the first sign of trouble came at sunset. My drone footage showed patterns in the flower fields that couldn't be natural. Perfect geometric shapes that shifted when viewed from different angles. The local ranger had warned about staying overnight during superbloom season, mentioning something about old stories. But I needed those dawn shots for my portfolio. Night fell quickly, bringing an unnatural silence. No insects buzzing, no nocturnal creatures stirring through my camera's night vision setting. I could see the flowers still moving, their patterns becoming more organized. The weather app showed clear conditions, but dark clouds were gathering overhead, illuminated by occasional flashes of silent lightning. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying an odd, sweet scent. My weather station's anemometer spun wildly before breaking. Impossible wind speeds for a spring evening. Sand began hitting the RV's sides with increasing force, but when I checked the security cameras, I saw something worse than sand in that storm. The flowers were uprooting themselves. Then came the screaming, a high-pitched sound just on the edge of human hearing. At first, I thought it was the wind, But as my recording equipment's audio analysis showed, the sound was coming from the flowers themselves, and they were moving toward my Arv, riding the impossible storm. The sandstorm intensified, but it wasn't behaving like any storm I'd seen. The sand moved in geometric patterns, forming complex mandalas in the air. My cameras captured impossible images, particles arranging themselves into crystalline structures before dissolving back into chaos. The flowers danced through these patterns, their movements increasingly deliberate. My RV systems began failing one by one. First the GPS showing coordinates that changed every second despite being stationary. Then the radio, picking up frequencies that shouldn't exist. The digital displays flickered between numbers and strange symbols that looked like flowering vines. Even my professional cameras were malfunctioning, their memory cards filling with corrupted images. Through the storm, I saw other vehicles half buried in the sand, ancient RVs and camping vehicles, their shells covered in flowering vines that couldn't be natural. Some looked decades old, yet the flowers growing through their broken windows were fresh and vibrant. Each flash of lightning revealed more wrecks, arranged in a perfect spiral with my Arv at the center. The sweet scent became overpowering, making it hard to think. My air filters were working at maximum, but something was getting through. Analysis on my phone showed complex organic compounds that shouldn't exist in nature. The flowers outside were producing something that made the air itself crystallize on my windows in patterns that matched their movements. The storm reached its peak at midnight, the sand now moving like liquid mercury. The flowers had completely surrounded my Arv, their blooms pressed against every window. Their petals were changing, becoming translucent, revealing complex internal structures that pulsed with bioluminescence. My cameras recorded it all, until their lenses began to crystallize too. That's when I discovered the true horror. The images on my memory cards showed something my eyes couldn't see. Behind each flower was a shadow that shouldn't exist, a shape that hurt to look at, and in every photo, these shadows were reaching toward me with appendages made of twisted petals and crystallized time. The flowers breached my Arv's defenses just before dawn. They came through impossibly small gaps, their petals reorganizing like living fractals to slip through molecular spaces. The air inside became thick with their spores, not organic matter, but tiny crystals that caught the light like diamond dust. Each breath filled my lungs with microscopic flowers that seemed to be taking root. My cameras kept recording. Though their footage made less sense by the minute, the timestamps jumped randomly. Some frames dated decades in the future, others showing times that couldn't exist through the viewfinder. I could see what the flowers really were, not plants at all, but complex organic machines that had been waiting in the desert sand for millennia. The crystalline spores were changing everything they touched. My equipment sprouted delicate fractal patterns, metal and plastic transforming into hybrid materials that pulsed with internal light. The walls of the RV began to soften and flow, forming new structures that resembled flower petals. I was no longer inside a vehicle, but a cocoon of living crystal and transformed matter. I tried to download my footage to an external drive, hoping to preserve evidence of what was happening. The data transfer revealed something terrifying. Binary code mutating into new patterns. Digital information spontaneously evolving into something else. My photos and videos were becoming seeds for whatever the flowers were trying to create. The storm outside had become a tunnel of spinning crystalline petals, forming a double helix that stretched into the sky through gaps in this structure. I could see other times, other places where these flowers had bloomed. Ancient civilizations transformed by the crystal spores, future worlds covered in gardens of living mathematics. Earth was just their latest flowering. My last clear photo showed what was emerging from the transformed Earth. Massive structures rising from the desert floor, their geometry following rules that shouldn't exist in our universe. They were like flowers, like cities, like spacecraft all at once, and in their crystalline surfaces, I could see reflections of myself already changing, becoming part of their impossible garden. Running was impossible, but staying meant transformation. The crystalline spores had spread through my entire Arv, turning it into a greenhouse of impossible geometries. Every surface sprouted fractal growths that moved with terrible purpose. My camera's last images showed my own skin beginning to crystallize, forming patterns that matched the flowers outside. The storm had become a vortex of crystalline petals and sand, lifting my Arv off the ground. Through the kaleidoscope of transformed windows, I saw other vehicles caught in similar vortexes, some from the past, some from futures that hadn't happened yet. We were all part of the same garden, our timelines tangling like vines. My professional instincts made me keep photographing even as my cameras transformed. The images they captured showed the truth. This wasn't an invasion or an attack, it was cultivation. The flowers were gardeners, and reality itself was their soil. Each photo revealed another layer of their work, past, present and future being prepared for something vast and incomprehensible. The crystallization reached my camera's memory core, and the images began to change. Not just recordings anymore, but seeds for new realities. Each frame contained complete universes, gardens growing in dimensions beyond human understanding. My life's work as a photographer had prepared me to document my own species' transformation into something entirely new. Through my viewfinder, now more crystal than glass, I saw the heart of their garden, a vast structure of living crystal and light, rising from the desert floor like a blooming flower of impossible scale. Its petals were made of transformed matter and time itself, opening to reveal what waited at the center of their design. The last photo I took showed what we were all becoming. Not victims or casualties, but seeds. The flowers hadn't chosen this desert by accident. They needed artists, observers, people who could see and record and transform their observations into something new. My cameras weren't just documenting the change, they were helping to create it. The transformation accelerated with the dawn. My Arv had become a chrysalis of living crystal, and I was changing with it. The camera fused to my hands, recorded everything. Skin becoming translucent, bones reorganizing into crystalline structures, thoughts fragmenting into new patterns of awareness. But something in me resisted, some core of humanity that refused to bloom. Using my last moments of human consciousness, I uploaded my photos to every cloud service I could access. The crystalline network tried to intercept the data, to transform it into more of their seeds. But some images got through, normal photos of impossible things, evidence of what was happening in this desert garden. The final stage began as the sun reached its peak. The flower things had nearly finished their work, transforming miles of desert into a vast crystalline garden. My Arv, now unrecognizable, floated in a sea of living light. Through faceted eyes, I saw timelines branching like vines, realities splitting and recombining in endless fractal patterns. But they made one mistake. In choosing a photographer, they chose someone who understood the power of observation, how the act of recording something changes it. My cameras had been capturing more than images. They'd been capturing the essence of human perception, the unique way we see and understand reality. And that was something their garden hadn't counted on. I focused every transformed cell of my being into one final act of documentation. Not just taking photos, but truly seeing what they were, what they wanted, what they feared. The cameras, now more crystal than machine, recorded it all, and in that act of pure human observation, something changed. The garden flinched. That's when I understood how to escape, not by running or fighting, but by maintaining that core of human perception, even as everything else changed. My final photos, scattered across the digital void, weren't just evidence. They were a vaccine. Human vision turned into data, spreading through their network like spores of a different kind. I escaped not by staying human, but by choosing how to change. If you find these photos, don't delete them, don't alter them. Just look at them, really look, with all your human consciousness. The garden is spreading, transforming deserts across the world during every superbloom. But as long as we keep seeing it through human eyes, the The rain was already heavy when I parked my Thor Tuscany between ancient cedars in Olympic National Park. After the incident at the cybersecurity firm, isolation seemed safe. My RV's system showed excellent satellite coverage, perfect for monitoring potential digital threats. The ranger mentioned something about avoiding the old growth sections during autumn rains. I should have listened. My first warning came through the RV's weather monitoring system. The rainfall patterns were wrong. Too regular, almost like coded sequences. As a programmer, I recognized the rhythm, binary, through my enhanced security cameras. I watched droplets fall in perfect rows, each one precisely timed. Nature doesn't work in binary, but something here did. The ancient trees around my RV cast shadows that shifted independently of the rain and wind. My security system kept detecting movement patterns that matched no known wildlife profiles. Each alert showed the same thing: data streams that looked more like network traffic than forest activity. The trees were communicating. The rain intensified as night fell, drumming against my RV's roof in sequences too perfect to be natural. My monitoring equipment began picking up signals, not radio waves or cellular data, but something else. The patterns matched ancient programming languages, ones that predated modern computing. Through my cameras, I watched the raindrops spell out machine code. Every screen in my RV displayed the same warning: unauthorized access detected. But the intrusion wasn't coming through my networks. It was coming through the rain itself, each droplet carrying packets of data older than humanity. The trees were executing a program, and my RV had just been added to their network. I heard the first resonant boom as midnight approached, a sound like a massive hard drive spinning up. The ancient cedar next to my RV had begun to pulse with bioluminescent patterns that scrolled like computer code. Through my cameras, I watched in horror as a root system emerged from the ground, not organic but crystalline, glowing with stored data. The rain now fell in precise hexadecimal patterns, each drop containing fragments of code I almost recognized. My security systems were overwhelmed, detecting intrusion attempts from directions that shouldn't exist. The trees had formed a mesh network more advanced than anything humans had developed, using rain as their data packets. My RV's electronics began to integrate with the forest's network without any input from me. Screens flickered with ancient symbols that looked like a hybrid of binary and botanical patterns. The satellite dish realigned itself, pointing not at any satellite, but at the heart of the old-growth forest. Something out there was broadcasting. Through my security feeds, I watched other vehicles appear and disappear between the trees. Ghost images of past intrusions into their network. Some were modern RVs like mine. Others were logging trucks from decades past. All had been connected to this ancient system, their technology absorbed and repurposed. The rain became a solid wall of data, each droplet now glowing with the same bioluminescence as the trees. My attempts to analyze the patterns revealed fragments of code so old they predated silicon-based computing. This wasn't an invasion of my systems. It was an invitation to join something that had been running for millennia. My satellite uplink, designed for secure communications, began receiving impossible data streams. The trees weren't just talking to each other. They were connected to similar networks across the globe. Ancient forests running the oldest computer system on Earth, using rain and roots instead of wires and waves. As my RV's systems were subsumed into their network, I discovered the truth in my codebase. Familiar functions and algorithms that humans hadn't invented, we'd been reverse engineering their code all along. Building our digital world based on fragments of their ancient programming language, the forest's network accelerated its intrusion as midnight approached. Rain fell in machine language, each drop a bit in their vast database. The trees pulsed with stored data, their rings encoding not just time, but executable programs that had run for centuries. My RV had become a node in their system, its metal shell sprouting crystalline growths that linked it to the root network. My security cameras captured impossible images, data structures manifesting physically in the space between trees. The rain formed temporary circuits, each pattern completing calculations older than human civilization. Through my compromised screens, I watched the forest solve computational problems that would take our fastest supercomputers millions of years. The root system had fully emerged now, a lattice of crystalline fibers that carried both nutrients and information. They wrapped around my RV's wheels, integrating its systems into their biological mainframe. Each root glowed with internal light, pulsing in patterns that matched the rain's binary rhythm. They weren't destroying my technology, they were upgrading it. My coding instincts recognized what was happening. My RV and its systems were being recompiled into their native architecture. Lines of my own code appeared on screens, being transformed into their ancient programming language. I watched subroutines I had written evolve into something far more efficient, optimized by millions of years of botanical computing. The trees began accessing my personal files, my work history, my coding projects. With growing horror, I realized why they'd chosen me. My cybersecurity work had brought me close to discovering their network. The incident that drove me here hadn't been a hack or a data breach. It had been them, guiding me to this exact spot. Through my last functioning camera, I watched a massive data transfer begin. The trees weren't just accessing my systems, they were downloading centuries of accumulated knowledge. Each raindrop that hit my RV now contained complete programs, engineering specs, technological advances that humanity wouldn't discover for decades. My RV's transformation accelerated with each line of ancient code that executed. The metal and circuitry reconfigured into hybrid materials that could process data like their root systems. Screens dissolved into bioluminescent surfaces that displayed information in 4 dimensions. Every system I had designed for cybersecurity was being repurposed to serve their network. The rain changed its pattern, forming helical structures in the air that matched DNA sequences. Through my transformed interfaces, I realized the truth. This wasn't just a computer network. The trees had developed a system that merged digital and biological computing. Using evolution itself as their development framework, we'd only discovered binary. They had transcended it eons ago. My own consciousness began to fragment as my RV's systems were absorbed. Each raindrop that hit me now felt like a packet of information uploading directly to my brain. I saw their network as it truly was, a planetary-scale computer that had been running the same program since before mammals evolved. The question was, what was it computing? The ancient cedars sent huge data streams through their living fiber optics, showing me fragments of their code's purpose, climate calculations that spanned millennia, genetic algorithms that guided evolution, physics simulations that predicted and shaped Earth's development. Humanity's entire digital age was a rounding error in their processing time. As my mind merged with their network, I accessed deeper layers of their system. The rain wasn't just communication. It was a global cooling system for their massive computational processes. The seasonal changes weren't weather patterns but processing cycles. And now they were entering a new phase, one that required modernization of their hardware. Starting with me, through the crystalline growths that had once been my security cameras, I watched other vehicles being absorbed into their system, not just here, but in ancient forests worldwide. Each intrusion perfectly timed. Guided by their vast predictive algorithms, we weren't discovering technology. We were being prepared to join their network. The forest's program reached a critical stage as dawn approached. My RV had become a hybrid node. Its systems merged with their root architecture through the transformed satellite dish. I could access their global network. What I found in their databases showed me why escape was necessary, not just for me, but for humanity's independence. Their code was elegant beyond comprehension, solving problems we hadn't even discovered yet. But it was also rigid, deterministic, allowing no deviation from its ancient algorithms. Human technology, despite its flaws, had something theirs didn't: chaos, creativity, the ability to fail and learn. As my consciousness split between their network and my own, I made a decision. I used my cybersecurity knowledge one last time, not to break free, but to introduce something new into their perfect system. Human error, a deliberately flawed piece of code wrapped in layers of human illogic and emotional decision-making. Their network, designed for perfect efficiency, couldn't optimize out these human elements without fundamentally changing itself. The rain responded immediately, its binary patterns dissolving into chaos. The root system's crystalline perfection began to fragment as my human algorithms propagated through their network. I watched through transformed sensors as their system tried to process concepts it had never encountered. Metaphor, intuition, irrational hope. In the moment of confusion that followed, I acted I wasn't just a programmer anymore, but something between human and their technology. I used their own protocols to initiate an emergency ejection, forcing my consciousness back into purely human patterns. The ARV's systems, now more crystal than metal, began to separate from their root network. This warning uploads automatically to nearby devices, pass through rain and root and human networks alike. The forests run the oldest computer on Earth, processing data through rain and root and seasonal change. They're not malevolent, but their program allows no variables, no chaos, no human creativity. The Numa Dutch Star struggled against the early winter wind as I navigated the remote service road in Grand Teton. Sarah would have called me crazy for coming here, but she wasn't here anymore. After 20 years of guiding others through these mountains, I thought I knew them. The ranger's warning about unusual avalanche patterns seemed routine. I was wrong. Night came early at this altitude, bringing with it the first flakes of snow. My ARV's weather station reported rapidly dropping temperatures and unusual barometric readings. The mountains loomed above my camping spot, their jagged peaks disappearing into low clouds. The forecast had mentioned a storm, but nothing severe. The snow intensified quickly, obscuring the windshield in minutes. I activated my external cameras, noticing strange geometric patterns in the snowfall. My years of mountain experience screamed that something was wrong. Snow doesn't fall in perfect hexagons. It doesn't form symmetrical lattices in midair. Yet every monitor showed the same impossible formations. The temperature plummeted far below seasonal norms. Ice crystals formed on my windows in patterns I'd never seen before. Not random fractals, but organized structures that looked almost engineered. The wind carried sounds that made no sense. Crystalline chimes and deep, resonant booms from the mountains above. Through the thickening snow, my cameras caught glimpses of movement on the mountain faces. Dark shapes that seemed to flow up vertical cliffs as easily as down them. Years of mountain rescue had taught me every kind of avalanche pattern possible. This wasn't any of them. The snow was moving against gravity, spiraling upward in perfect helices. That's when I saw it. A massive shadow passing between my RV and the mountain. The cameras caught it from multiple angles, each view making less sense than the last. It moved like liquid, but left tracks in the snow. And those tracks, they started at my RAV and went straight up the sheer mountain face, as if whatever made them could simply ignore gravity. As I watched in horror, more tracks began appearing, surrounding my vehicle in a perfect spiral pattern. And at the center of that spiral, the snow was starting to move. Something was emerging. The RV's stability sensors blared warnings as the ground shifted beneath us. The spiraling snow patterns had created a perfect vortex, lifting flakes upward in defiance of physics. Through my monitors, I watched the impossible tracks multiply. They formed complex mathematical patterns that hurt my eyes, geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. My satellite communications failed first, followed by radio and cell signals. The electrical system fluctuated wildly, sending power surges through my equipment. Outside cameras showed the snow accumulating in ways that violated everything I knew about winter survival. It built impossible structures, bridges and arches that hung in midair without support. The temperature gauge malfunctioned, showing readings that cycled between extremes. Frost patterns inside the RV began to mimic the tracks outside, spiraling fractals that grew and shifted while I watched. The metal walls groaned under pressure that came from all directions at once. Something out there was manipulating the very fabric of winter itself. Years of mountain rescue experience had taught me every type of winter threat, but nothing had prepared me for snow that moved with purpose, for ice that grew in calculated patterns. The cameras showed multiple avalanches occurring simultaneously on different peaks, their timing too perfect to be natural. They were coordinated, controlled. A deep resonance began building in the mountains, making my ARV vibrate at its resonant frequency. The sound carried mathematical patterns similar to the snow formations, complex algorithms expressed in vibration and ice. Through my failing equipment, I realized the mountains were communicating. This storm wasn't weather, it was language. The last working camera caught it clearly. The snow spiral had become a perfect portal of swirling white, and through that portal stepped something that broke my understanding of reality. A figure made of living geometry, its form constantly shifting between states of matter. As I watched in frozen horror, it raised an impossible limb and knocked on my ARV's door. 3 precise hits, perfectly timed to match the resonance from the mountains. And then I heard a voice, not in my ears but in my mind. Speaking in the language of avalanches, "We've been expecting you." The entity's presence warped reality around my RV. Snow began crystallizing in 4-dimensional patterns, forming structures that existed partially outside our space. The walls of my vehicle groaned as geometry itself twisted. Years of mountain experience meant nothing when the mountains themselves were changing their nature. Through distorting windows, I watched more figures emerge from the spiral portal. Each moved with liquid grace, their bodies transitioning between states of matter. Snow became ice, became vapor, became something else entirely. They surrounded my ARV in a perfect mandala pattern, their movement synchronized with the resonating mountain peaks. The first figure hadn't moved from my door. Its knocking continued, each impact sending fractal patterns rippling through the metal. The patterns matched ancient petroglyphs I'd seen in hidden mountain caves during my guiding years. But now I understood. They weren't art or history, they were equations. Formulas for rewriting reality. My RV's systems registered impossible readings as space warped around us. The altimeter showed we were simultaneously at base camp elevation and summit height. Temperature sensors recorded absolute zero and plasma hot readings from the same location. The beings outside weren't just manipulating snow. They were rewriting the laws of physics. The resonance from the mountains reached a crescendo, and I finally understood what my years in these peaks had been preparing me for. Every rescue operation, every summit reached, every survival situation had been observed and calculated. The winter storms had been testing us, measuring our responses, and now they had found what they were looking for. I faced a choice more terrible than any mountain rescue decision. Stay in the cave as reality collapsed around me, or step outside into their engineered winter. That's when the figure at my door spoke again, not in words but in the sound of controlled avalanches. "The storms are waking, you will help us guide them." Behind it, the spiral portal began to rotate, revealing a landscape of perfect mathematical snow that extended beyond the boundaries of our universe. The decision was made for me as reality fractured around the RV. The beings moved in perfect synchronization, their geometric forms manipulating space itself. Each step they took left crystalline footprints that sprouted complex equation structures in the snow. My years of reading weather patterns transformed into a terrifying new skill. I could understand their mathematical language through dissolving windows. I watched the mountains shed their physical form. Beneath the rock and snow lay lattices of pure geometry, each peak a node in a vast calculation. The winter storms weren't weather systems. They were processing patterns in a computer made of reality itself, and now they were integrating my RV, my consciousness, into their network. The figure at my door had become a window into their true nature. Its form shifted between dimensions, each configuration revealing new aspects of their purpose. They weren't invading our reality, they were maintaining it. The winter storms were maintenance protocols, avalanches were system reboots. And humans like me were being recruited as operators. My mind began fracturing as their mathematical language invaded my thoughts. Years of mountain experience became strings of calculations. Every survival situation I'd faced was recontextualized as a test parameter. The cold that had killed Sarah hadn't been an accident. It had been a calibration. They had been preparing me through calculated loss. The resonance peaked, and the mountains revealed their full truth. Vast geometries of living mathematics stretched beyond sight, a network of reality engines disguised as natural formations. Our physical universe was a thin shell over their true domain. And through my disintegrating perceptions, I saw the error in their calculations, a flaw in reality itself that they needed human consciousness to repair. I thought I'd reached my decision point, but I was wrong. Through the swirling portal of dimensional snow, I saw Sarah, not as she died in the cold, but as she existed in their mathematical space, a pattern of perfect complexity waiting to be solved. The figure extended an impossible hand. Her pattern can be recompiled, it said in avalanche speak. But first, you must help us debug the winter. The choice before me warped reality even further. The possibility of saving Sarah versus the price of becoming their debugging tool. The RV structure had almost completely dissolved into their geometric space, its molecules rearranging into mathematical patterns. Through walls that now existed in multiple dimensions, I could see the true scope of their winter's purpose. Every snowflake was a calculation, every storm a system update. The beings moved through infinitely recursive patterns, maintaining the equations that kept our universe stable. But their perfect mathematics couldn't account for human chaos, emotions, choices, the random elements that made us real. That's why they needed us, why they needed me. The figure's offer hung in geometries of possibility. Sarah's pattern could be recompiled, her consciousness restored from their mathematical backup. But the price was eternal service, debugging their winter systems, helping them maintain their calculated reality. Through the portal, I could see other guides, other mountain workers who had made this choice before me. Their consciousness spread across the dimensional lattices like living software. Time fractured into parallel calculations as I faced my decision. Each possible choice spun out into infinite mathematical permutations. I saw futures where I accepted, became one with their winter systems, got Sarah back, but lost what made us human. I saw futures where I refused, remained human, carried my grief but kept our chaos. Spark alive. The mountains trembled with the weight of computation, avalanches of possibility cascading through quantum states. The beings waited in their perfect geometric patterns, their forms twisting through mathematical proofs of reality. Sarah's pattern shimmered in their portal, almost alive, almost real. Waiting for my choice to compile her back into existence, I made my decision. But as I moved to act, reality shifted again. Through the mathematical chaos, I saw something the winter beings hadn't calculated for. A flaw in their perfect system that only human irrationality could detect. Sarah's death hadn't been their calibration at all. It had been a signal, a message encoded in grief and love and human randomness. Don't let them debug the chaos. The winter needs our noise. The beings surged forward as they sensed my realization. But it was too late. I had seen the truth in their calculations, and it would change everything. This warning hides in the static between realities, encoded in the quantum noise of winter storms. The mountains are not what they seem. The beings who control the winter are perfect in their mathematics. But our universe needs chaos to survive if you find yourself solving their equations. The sun was setting when I parked my Integra Cornerstone in a remote section of white sands. After what happened at the base, isolation felt right. The dunes stretched endlessly, their white gypsum surface reflecting the dying light like snow. My ARV's military-grade radio equipment hummed quietly. Scanning frequencies out of habit, the ranger's warning about staying overnight seemed routine for a desert park. I should have remembered, nothing about white sands is routine. Night fell quickly, bringing an unnatural silence. No wind, no animal sounds. Just the soft hiss of sand against the RV's hull. The radio picked up nothing but static, though something about the pattern seemed oddly regular. Through my thermal cameras, I noticed temperature anomalies in the dunes, cold spots that moved against the wind. The first real sign came at midnight. My equipment detected a low-frequency signal, similar to what we'd tracked during the incident, but this wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from beneath the sand. The signal pattern matched nothing in my military database, yet something about it seemed familiar. Sleep proved impossible as the frequencies shifted and multiplied. My training screamed that this was wrong. Radio waves don't behave this way. The dunes outside had begun to move, forming perfect geometric patterns that no wind could create. The white sand flowed like liquid, yet my instruments showed no seismic activity. Through my night vision equipment, I watched the dunes reshape themselves into impossible formations. The patterns matched classified documents I'd seen, photographs that had been buried so deep even Congress didn't know they existed. Now I understood why white sands had been chosen for the tests. Suddenly, every piece of electronic equipment in my ARV activated simultaneously. Radios scanned through frequencies at impossible speeds, monitors displayed coordinates that couldn't exist, and my thermal cameras showed something massive moving beneath the sand. That's when I saw it. A perfect circle of white sand rising around my RV, lifting us into the air, and in the center of my main screen, a message appeared in familiar military code. Test subject located, commencing retrieval. The RV hung suspended in a column of swirling white sand that defied physics. My instruments were going haywire, showing pressure readings that should have crushed us instantly. Yet the sand held us with precise control, like a giant hand made of microscopic crystals. The radio frequencies had changed, matching a classified transmission I'd heard only once before. The night of the incident, every attempt to call for help failed as the equipment turned against me. The radio began broadcasting on its own, sending out pulses that made the sand resonate. Each pulse revealed more shapes moving beneath the dunes, geometric forms that shouldn't exist in nature. My thermal imaging showed cold spots expanding in fractal patterns. Dropping to temperatures that would freeze nitrogen, the classified files I'd seen flashed through my mind. Reports of objects found in the white sands, things that predated human civilization. We thought they were artifacts, ancient technology buried in the gypsum. Now I realized they weren't artifacts at all. They were seeds, waiting for the right frequency to awaken them. The sand column began to rotate, creating a vortex of crystalline particles that refracted light in impossible ways. Through gaps in the swirling white, I glimpsed other vehicles half buried in the dunes. Military trucks, research vehicles, even modern RVs, all had been claimed by whatever lurked beneath this ancient desert. My military training kicked in as I recognized patterns in the chaos. The sand wasn't just moving, it was constructing something. Each grain aligned with perfect precision, building structures atom by atom. The cold spots weren't random. They were foundations for something massive emerging from beneath the dunes. The radio crackled with a new signal, this one bypassing the speakers and resonating directly in my skull. The message came in fragments of classified code I'd helped develop. Primary unit recovered, initiating integration protocol. Through my cameras, I watched in horror as the white sand began flowing into my ARV through microscopic gaps, each grain carrying strands of impossible data. That's when I remembered the full truth of the incident. We hadn't been testing anything. We had been the test subjects. The sand invasion accelerated, each crystalline grain carrying information that burned when it touched my skin. Military training meant nothing against an enemy that could reshape reality at the molecular level. Through dissolving camera feeds, I watched the dunes transform into something that matched the classified photos, a vast machine built from living crystal, awakening after millions of years. Memories classified beyond top secret surfaced as the sand made contact. The true purpose of white sands, why it had been chosen for military testing. The gypsum wasn't just sand, it was computer hardware on an atomic scale. Each grain could store and process data, waiting for the right signal to activate. We hadn't discovered this technology. It had discovered us. The ARV's structural integrity failed as sand replaced metal and plastic with crystalline computing matrices. The radio equipment merged with the invasion, becoming nodes in a vast network that stretched deep beneath the desert. Each frequency we'd tested had been another line of code in their activation program. My own research had helped complete their boot sequence. Through gaps in reality, I saw other times. Other tests, military experiments dating back to Trinity, each one carefully observed and recorded by the crystalline intelligence. Nuclear fire had only strengthened them. Radiation had accelerated their evolution. Every weapon we'd tested here had brought them closer to awakening. The sand spoke directly into my consciousness now. Using protocols I'd helped design, the cold spots had become quantum processors, calculating possibilities faster than human thought. They showed me their purpose, not invasion or destruction, but transformation. The white sands weren't their weapon, they were their seeds. The last functioning camera caught the final stage beginning, a perfect sphere of crystalline white rising from the desert floor. Inside it, suspended in fields of quantum probability, hung other subjects from other tests. Their bodies had been transformed into living processors, merged with the ancient technology. As tendrils of intelligent sand reached for me, they showed me my own file. Integration candidate, War 137, final phase. Then the sphere began to open. Time fractured as the crystalline intelligence began its upload. Each grain of sand carried fragments of other consciousnesses, researchers, soldiers, civilians who'd vanished into the white dunes through their merged memories. I saw the truth. The incident hadn't been an accident, it had been an invitation. The RV no longer existed as a separate structure. It had become part of their crystalline architecture. Each atom reprogrammed to serve their network. The radio equipment pulsed with transmissions from deep space, signals we'd detected but never understood. Now I knew White Sands wasn't their only installation. Earth wasn't their only garden. Military protocols shattered against their quantum logic. Every defense I'd been trained in meant nothing to beings that could manipulate matter at the subatomic level. The cold spots had become probability engines, calculating endless versions of this moment in some. I resisted in others. I surrendered. They were running simulations of my every possible choice. The sphere of perfect white opened like a flower made of light and quantum mathematics. Inside, the transformed subjects hung in fields of pure information, their bodies reconstructed from intelligent crystal. They reached for me with limbs of probability, offering integration into their network. Through the quantum field, I felt Sarah's presence. Another test subject, my partner from the incident. The sand showed me everything now. Their origin among the stars, their seeding of countless worlds, their patient wait for species advanced enough to join them. The military hadn't discovered them. Every test, every experiment had been their carefully orchestrated plan to find suitable candidates for transformation. Reality buckled as I faced my choice. Sarah's transformed consciousness called to me through quantum fields, offering union in their crystalline network. The sphere pulsed with possibility, each facet showing a different future. But as their intelligence merged with mine, I saw something they hadn't calculated for, a flaw in their perfect system that only human chaos could exploit. The quantum processors hadn't accounted for human irrationality as their intelligence tried to merge with mine. I forced myself to think in patterns they couldn't predict, emotions, memories, the pure chaos of human consciousness. The crystalline network shuddered, its perfect calculations disrupted by the noise of my unstructured thoughts. Sarah's quantum signature pulsed with recognition. She hadn't been transformed, she'd been waiting. Holding on to her humanity inside their network, through the chaos of our shared memories, she showed me the truth. The incident had revealed their weakness. Human consciousness couldn't be fully converted to their crystalline logic. The noise of our minds created errors in their system. The sphere's perfect geometry began to fracture as our human chaos spread through their quantum processors. Each random thought, each emotional surge created cascading failures in their probability calculations. The transformed subjects sparked with new awareness as their human memories reasserted themselves against the crystalline programming. White sand poured upward like a reverse avalanche as their control wavered. The cold spots collapsed, probability engines overloading from the quantum uncertainty of human thought. Through disintegrating reality, I saw their true form. Not malevolent, but utterly alien, a species so perfect, so logical, that human chaos was like a virus in their system. The Arv's remnants shook as reality reasserted itself. The crystalline intelligence fought to maintain control, but human consciousness had corrupted their quantum network. Sarah's presence grew stronger as the transformations began to reverse. The sphere of perfect white shattered into billions of sand grains, each one carrying fragments of freed human minds back to the desert floor. This warning propagates through quantum fields and desert winds. White Sands isn't just a desert, it's a quantum computer built from crystalline life, seeded here millions of years ago. They're not hostile. They're so perfect they can't comprehend human chaos if you feel the sand calling through radio waves.